Evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm Debbie Schwartz, founder of Road to College and the Paying for College 101 Facebook group. And I'm here tonight with Chris Abkarians of Juno. And tonight's topic is about understanding student aid index, which is important for everyone to know kind of what that means, how it's calculated, what it's going to mean to your family's cost of going to college. But before we jump in, let me just do some quick housekeeping. These are technically Zoom meetings, and I only share that because you can unmute yourself if you really want to ask a question. And people do that sometimes, and it's really nice just to hear people's voice. And it's also easier for you to sometimes ask a question. You can also put yourself on video, which is also nice to see people. But if you aren't going to say anything, it is better for all of us if you can keep yourself muted so we don't hear background noises. This is recorded, and we will send a link we will send an email tomorrow with a link to the recording. Feel free to put your questions in the chat. I will be looking at them as we go through. Sometimes I can just answer them right off the bat, and I'll try and answer them. Otherwise, we'll bring it up with Chris probably towards the end of the session. And just happy that you guys are all here and willing to keep learning about this crazy topic of paying for college. So one last thing before we really dig in, please put into the chat where you're watching from and what year. Somebody already started. Thank you, Helen. What year in high school your student is, and if you've even kind of found out what your SAI is. I'm always kind of curious to know, how much pre-work somebody has done before coming to any of these sessions. And it's no judgment if you haven't, and it's perfectly fine if you don't even know what SAI is all about, because that's what tonight is for. So I'm going to hand it off to Chris, who will share a little bit about himself and Juno. Juno is a partner that we've worked with now, I think like 4 years, maybe even 5 years, Chris. And
Yep.
we do a lot of great webinars with them, and you'll hear more about them really from now till like the August timeframe if you need to know more about loans and where to get the best rates. So Chris, it's yours to go with.
Thank you very much for the intro, Debbie, and thank you everybody for making it here this evening. I'm Chris Abkarians. I'm one of the founders of a company called Juno that I'll tell you a little bit more about in a moment. And I'm here to talk to you about how student aid index works. So for the next hour, we're going to go through an agenda that kind of looks like the following. I like to start these webinars with an overview of the federal student aid timeline, which is basically just what happens between when you submit the FAFSA all the way through to when you have to pay the tuition bill for a given school. And so we're going to put things in that context, both for this webinar and for future webinars. I'll give you a brief overview of what student aid index actually is. Before we even dive in there, the reason this is important to listen to is when you fill out FAFSA, that form is going to calculate a number, and that number gets used by the financial aid office to create your financial aid award package. And so what we're going to walk through tonight is just understanding how that number actually gets calculated and what that means for certain things you may or may not be able to do. And so most of the conversation is going to be in that third section where we walk through in detail an example of how that number gets calculated. We'll spend about 2 minutes just on strategies that you could use to theoretically reduce your student aid index. There's not many, but we'll touch on the few that could impact things and what you should watch out for when you're filling out FAFSA. And I'm going to walk through in the final section a pretty deep dive on pretending I'm a financial aid advisor who's putting together your financial aid package. and we'll kind of show you what are the different buckets of money that I can make available to you, and what order would I give them to you in, and how much might I be able to give to you based on an example, so that you have a better idea for how all of this works. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the chat as we go through tonight, or you can save them for the end, and I'm happy to stay for as long as it takes to answer them. And with that, I'll dive in. So let's start off with that quick timeline for financial aid. The first thing is filling out FAFSA, which for anybody who will be attending college in the fall of 2026, you can already fill that form out. It opened a few days before October 1st this year, and so you can fill it out now if you want to. About 1 to 3 days. Yes.
Sorry, can I just interrupt and give just a piece of advice that we got from the woman who's the head of NAFSA over the summer, which I thought was such good advice. And she actually was recommending that anybody can go and fill out FAFSA now. You don't have to even be, I mean, obviously, if you're a senior, it's important, you need to, but you could have a junior in high school, you could have a sophomore in high school, and go and fill it out. And then instead of kind of like estimating and then you obviously you get your real number, and nothing happens to that FAFSA because you don't put any college information on it. So it just kind of like nobody sees it other than you, and you see the number. Anyhow, so I'm just throwing that out there
Sure.
as a piece of advice for anybody here who wants to get their real SAI number and to see what the FAFSA is all about. You can go do it for real, and it has no implication if your student's not applying to college this year.
That's good advice and absolutely true. And if you are a parent of a junior or a sophomore listening now and you do fill it out, or a parent of a senior, the next step once you do fill out FAFSA is that you'll get your student aid index number about 1 to 3 days after you submit the form. And tonight we'll talk a lot about what that number actually means for your overall financial aid package. For most regular decision apps, those will be due end of December, early January. And for most schools, you would get your financial aid package in the March or April timeframe. And so there's going to be another webinar we do that tends to be the most popular webinar that we do. And it's meant to help you understand, once you get your financial aid package, are there things you can do to actually appeal the amount of aid that you've been provided? Short answer is yes. And well in advance of when you should start doing this, we'll host a webinar to walk through in detail the things that you should pay attention to and the most common reasons why you may be eligible to appeal for more aid. Typically around May is when you will have decided which school you're going to attend. And tuition for most programs, this shifts a bit. It's typically due somewhere around August or September. And so if after you've maximized the amount of financial aid available to you, you still do need some help to pay for school, then you would look at your student loan options, typically somewhere between May and July. And a lot of why Juno exists is to help people better understand what those options look like, and to make it very easy to compare those options when the time comes. And so I want to walk through just one very high level thing that we'll go into this in more detail in the future. But something is going to be different this year for people going to school for the first time than it has in previous years. And really the key thing to understand is that as a result of some congressional legislation that passed this summer, there's going to be reduced loan limits available to parents of students in future years. If you're listening and your children are already enrolled in college, then under most circumstances, you can be grandfathered into the current way things work. Nothing changes. But if your children aren't yet enrolled in college, and if they're going to be attending college for the first time next fall or later, then one of the key things to understand that we'll go through more in future webinars is that a lot of parents rely on something called a Parent Plus loan. And today you can borrow as much as you need up to whatever the school says school costs to attend. But starting next year and beyond, that'll be limited to $20,000 per year. And so I'm going to skip this really quickly. We're going to focus tonight on what I think is one of the more important things to just get a grasp on before you think about the rest of the steps that are involved in this process. And so we're going to do a deep dive on getting your student aid index. Once you understand how student aid index works and how what you input into FAFSA impacts your student aid index, then you're going to have a lot more confidence to decide whether or not you're going to appeal your financial aid award letter when it comes in a few months from now. And hopefully, once you've appealed, you can reduce the amount of money that you need to borrow and be in the best financial shape for the upcoming academic year. So student aid index gets thrown around a lot. I'm going to break it down into really the reason it exists. So this is a number we're going to get into in a little bit that is just calculated based on the formula that Congress created. And you basically, it says you submit the FAFSA form. That form collects certain types of information about your family's financial picture. And there's a formula that's meant to take all the different types of information that you put on the FAFSA form and to turn it into a single number. And that single number is supposed to represent whether your family needs a lot of financial help to attend college or less financial help to attend college. It is not perfect. Not everything about your financial picture can be captured in the FAFSA form. It's really a starting point that's meant to work for the broadest possible set of people. And before we dive into how it gets calculated and what it's used for, I just want to stress that point more than anything else, that the way that this number gets calculated, it's not perfect. And because it's not perfect, there are many things that you may want to tell the financial aid office about yourself that you can't put anywhere in the form. Don't worry, you will have an opportunity to do so. And that's going to be part of the appeals process that we'll cover in future webinars. I see one quick question that I'll just touch on from Laura, which is the Parent Plus loan limit maximum per child? And yes, it is per child. So we're going to have a lot of numbers in this presentation. I'm going to focus all of it, as much of it as I can, on an example that I'll go through on the next slide. But at the highest level, student aid index is not your financial aid award package. It's really just a number that the financial aid officer who's going to get your financial aid data uses to allocate the different buckets of federal funding that are available to them to give to you. And so it's a number that ranges from negative 1,500 up to 9 million something. And by itself, this number doesn't really mean very much. The lower the number is, generally speaking, the financial aid officer looks at it and says, okay, you need more help. The higher the number is, the less likely it is that they'll be able to offer you any help. And the way that they're going to use it at the most basic level is this. So there's a financial need is a very specific thing that your school's financial aid office is trying to calculate. And there's a very simple formula that's set up that tells them what that is. You take whatever the cost of attendance for the school is, you subtract the student aid index, and that equals the level of financial need that your family has in the eyes of the school. You could need more than that, but this is just how the formula works. Cost of attendance, for people who may not yet know, is meant to encompass the full sticker price of going to college. And so that includes not just tuition, but also any mandatory fees, plus health insurance, plus living expenses. Each school should be publishing this on their financial aid website, and it's a number that's meant to cover what it costs to go to school for 1 year at a time. It's not meant to cover all 4 years of college. And so we're going to go through an example at the end of this presentation of pretending again that I'm a financial aid officer, that I'm seeing a family that has $15,000 of financial need and trying to see what buckets of aid am I able to provide them so that they can reduce the amount that they'll have to pay out of pocket to go to school. And before we do that, the key thing to understand in all of this is that the smaller your student aid index number is, the more financial need you have. One of the more common questions I get is, how do I find my SAI? So you'll get a copy of these slides, so you don't have to necessarily take notes here. But there's 2 times that you're going to see it. The first time is when you submit the FAFSA form. Pretty much immediately after, there is an estimated SAI, which again stands for Student Aid Index. And about 1 to 3 days after that submission, you're going to get another email that says you have a final Student Aid Index that has been calculated. And you can log back into the same portal where you filled out FAFSA form on studentaid.gov. You click on something called View FAFSA Submission Summary. And then there's a tab that you can navigate to that will show you what your official SAI number is. And now, before we dive into how it gets calculated, I can't stress enough that SAI is not your financial aid package. Again, it is just a tool. It's a number that the financial aid officer is going to use to do their best to allocate aid to you, which we'll go through at the end. I'll pause there just to see if there's any questions we should maybe touch on before we dive into the math itself.
There's a question, but I think it'd be better off that you go through the math, and maybe
Sure.
I answered it, but I think it'd be worth discussing.
Yes. Okay, great. So SAI has a formula that was made up by Congress, and it's really made up of 3 components. So we're going to go through each of these components in a lot of detail for the next 20 to 30 minutes. The first thing we're going to calculate is what is called parent contribution. And so when you submit your FAFSA, there's a bunch of information you provide about your income and about your assets as a parent. And that all gets whittled down to a single number called parent contribution. There's a second thing that we're going to go through, which is the student's income. And so based on whatever income the student has, there's another set of formulas that say from that income, we expect that this amount of money is available to help pay towards school. And then there's a final number that we calculate, which is just student assets. And that basically just says, depending on how much assets the student has, this is the haircut version of what FAFSA says needs to go into SAI. You add those 3 numbers together, we're going to go through how you actually derive those numbers, and you get this single number. A very important thing to understand here is that the income that goes into your FAFSA form is always based on your tax returns from 2 years ago. And so for those who are parents of seniors right in high school right now, if your children are going to be attending college next fall, then you're going to be filling out the FAFSA form for the 2026-2027 academic year. That form is based off of your 2024 taxes. If you are, and for those of you who are parents of juniors, when you're filling out the form FAFSA that will go to the schools, it's going to be based off of your 2025 taxes and so forth. You're going to have to fill out the form once every single year that the student is in school. And the other thing to keep in mind is that when you do fill it out, there's a portion that asks about your assets. We're going to go through a few of those. Your assets are actually based on the value as of the day that you submit the form. So income is going to be based on 2 years ago. Assets are going to be based on today. For most of this presentation, we're going to go through a very specific example. And this is just for simplicity. I'm happy to walk through more complicated scenarios if anyone is curious, both at the end of the presentation and offline. In this scenario, let's just assume that we're submitting the FAFSA form and calculating the student aid index, and then looking through the financial aid package for a family of four with a student who is dependent and parents who are married filing taxes jointly. We're going to assume that this parent's combined income, or AGI, is going to be $80,000 for the relevant tax year when they submitted the form. We're going to assume that they have assets of $50,000, excluding the value of their primary residence and any retirement accounts, and that the student had $15,000 of income, and that the student has $2,000 in the savings account. And so we'll use that example throughout, and we're going to calculate exactly how your SAI is derived for this example family. So the first example I'm going to go through here, it's the most complicated one. So bear with me, because getting to the parent contribution portion of SAI has the most adjustments that are done. And then when we get to the student, it's going to be a lot simpler. We're going to start with something that effectively the way that the formula is set up calls parent available income. That's where this whole thing starts on the parent side. And parent available income is defined as, we'll take whatever income you had on your 2024 tax return, and then we're going to subtract out a couple of different things that the formula says we shouldn't count. And so it says, okay, you had $80,000 in income, but you had to pay some taxes. And so we can't count any of that as income that's available to help pay for college. And depending on the size of your family, you need a certain amount of money just for basic living expenses. And so we're not going to count any of that either. And in this example, for a family of four, when you go through that more complicated math, you'd basically say, all right, you had $80,000 of income, $65,000 of it is protected. And so only $14,800 of your income is actually available to help pay towards school. The larger your family size is, the more of your income gets protected. So there's a slide that's in the appendix. I won't go to it now, but we can at the end of the presentation, or you can when you get a copy of these slides, that just shows what that income protection allowance looks like based on the size of your family. But the general idea really just is, this is meant to say, of all the income you've made, what are we going to exclude and what is going to be left. The next step is that we add to that parent available income something called the parent's contribution from assets. And so in the example that I'm using, we're just blanket assuming that this family has $50,000 of assets to their name on the day that they submitted FAFSA. Before I even get into how this math works, I'm confident we're going to get some questions around this. So there's a lot of things that you include in assets in the FAFSA form itself, and there are some very important things that you don't include at all. We have a separate presentation on FAFSA and some of the things to watch out for when you're filling it out. And that goes into a lot more detail for what to include and what not to include. At a high level, what I'll just cover right now is that the way FAFSA is set up, you're not supposed to report the value of your primary residence. And you're not supposed to report any of the retirement accounts that you have. And there's also a slightly longer list of other things that are somewhat less common that you exclude. And so assets would be some things like, how much savings you have in your bank account, what stocks and bonds do you own, what investment properties do you own, what businesses do you own, and how much are they worth. And so those are the things that you want to focus on when filling out the FAFSA form. And for this example family, they went through the instructions and that left them with $50,000 of assets. Now, the federal government doesn't say that you have to use all $50,000 of the assets that you have left to pay towards college. They're going to make two sets of adjustments to this. So the first is they're going to say, all right, only 12% of the $50,000 of assets that this family has is actually available towards paying for college. And so $6,000 is the number that we're going to back into here. We're going to take 50,000 times 12% equals 6,000. There's going to be more adjustments. One more adjustment that we're going to go through in just a minute. But we're going to now be at this intermediary point of just basically saying how much of the family's income and assets does the Department of Education think is available to help pay for school? And that's going to be the combination of what we just calculated for the income portion of 14,800 plus what we said is going to be available from your assets of 6,000. And so we're now at 20,800. Don't ask me why it's set up like this, but there is one more adjustment that happens on top of these numbers. And that's to say, basically, the parent has $20,800 in the eyes of the government's formula to help pay towards school, but we're not going to ask them to put all of that towards paying for school. We're instead going to apply something called a contribution adjustment. And so what you see on this chart in front of you is, think of it like tax brackets. The government says that you have $20,840 of income available. And if you look at the chart, they'd basically say that for the first $21,800 that's been calculated using the formulas that we just walked through, we're going to actually just say that only 22% of that is available to help to actually contribute towards your student aid index. But the higher these numbers go, the higher effectively that tax rate that you're going to end up paying. And so if you end up in a scenario where your parent adjusted available income is $43,900 or more, then you end up at the top marginal rate, where for the amount above that, 47% of that ends up counting towards SAI. This is a very long-winded and detailed way of saying that, and I'll show you one sensitivity table in about 10 minutes. You could be in a scenario where you have really high income and really small assets, or very large assets and very low income, and still end up contributing quite a bit towards SAI. And the way that these numbers end up breaking down, you will not end up having to contribute all of your income and assets towards paying for college. There will be a lot of haircuts to the numbers that go into it. And in a few minutes, we'll just walk through really just what are some of the key things that you want to watch out for. Because when you're submitting FAFSA and when you are reporting the value of your assets specifically, there are some mistakes that people make that I'll go through in a few minutes that can impact these numbers too. We're now done with what the parent contributes, which is to say that after this family had 80K of income and 50K of assets, only $4,585 for the upcoming year is going to contribute towards the student aid index for their students. Now we have two much simpler things to calculate. The first one is going to be how the FAFSA form determines your student's income gets treated, and the second is going to be how the student's assets get treated if they have any. And so student income, let's just assume in this example again that the student had an income of $15,000. And again, this would be income that they got 2 years ago. So for most people, it's probably a lot smaller than this. Again, that there is a set of protections against that income. And so for students, the math is a little bit simpler. Basically, what the government says is we're going to ignore any taxes that maybe you had to pay. And we're also going to say that the first $11,770 of income that the student earned gets excluded no matter what. It's as if it doesn't exist. And so when you take that student's $15,000 income and you subtract those protections from it, then you're left with $583 of student available income. And then there's just one really simple step after that, which is dividing it in two. So the way the math is set up, it just says, we'll take that $583. We're going to assume that only half of that is available to help pay towards school. And so the student's contribution from income towards their student aid index is only going to be $291. And the last step is calculating the student's assets, which is even simpler. Let's assume the student had $2,000 in the savings account as of the day that FAFSA was submitted. The way the math works is that they say that we're going to take 20% of that number, and that's going to be how much the student is expected to contribute from their assets. So we add another $400 to student aid index. Now, I believe there was a question at the top of this webinar that is probably worth touching on now a little bit, which is one of the key takeaways here is that the way that the student aid index math works, assets that are held in the name of the parent are treated a lot more favorably than assets that are held by the student. And so if you're in a situation where perhaps you wanted to transfer $10,000 to the student, that is going to be materially worse for their student aid index than if the same $10,000 sat in the parent's bank account. I can go through a little bit more math on exactly how that works and why, but that's just the key thing. You want to avoid making any kind of major transfers assets to the student other than a 529 account, so that you can avoid having those assets that are just shifted from one person to another be treated unfavorably when it comes to the math that gets conducted through FAFSA. So bringing all that together before we move on from there, we've gone through now really the most complicated math I think that there is when it comes to how FAFSA works in paying for college. And if you have questions, please don't worry. It took me a while to figure out exactly how this works. But using the example that we've walked through, the parent with the 80K of assets and 80K of income and 50K of assets ends up contributing $4,585 towards the SAI number. The student's income of 15K, that got translated to $291. And the student's assets of $2,000 got translated into another $400. And we bring all that together, and now this example family's student aid index is 5,276. By itself, again, this number doesn't actually mean that much, but in the next 20 minutes, I'm going to go through how you should actually interpret it and what it could mean for the level of financial aid that you receive. I'm going to pause here for questions before we move on to the section where we'll go through an example financial aid package.
Chris, there's a question about like how do you define parent assets? Like what are the assets that are included or are not included?
Good question. So let's just start with, there's a little bit of nuance to this, but you can think of it at the most basic level as everything that is legally in your name, except for the value of your primary residence or your retirement assets that sit in specific types of retirement accounts. Everything else would need to get reported. I believe there's 3 questions on FAFSA that ask you to report the value of assets. There's one that asks you about the value of the savings accounts. There's, and I believe the equities and bonds. There's another one that asks you about the value of other investments like investment real estate. And there's another one that asks you about the value of any family businesses where that you may own. And so there's a kind of comprehensive list of what you're supposed to answer, and uh, you're supposed to answer based on the values as of the day that you submit the form. There is a slide in the FAFSA, filling out FAFSA tips and tricks webinar that we did recently that goes through in a lot more detail exactly what is and is not included. Uh, it might be more effective if we, Debbie, maybe when we send a follow-up email, if we do, to include a direct link to that slide, and I can make sure to send that to you after.
Okay. So again, kind of on the asset questions, and I apologize because I was answering questions,
Sure.
so I didn't follow. I wasn't following all that you were saying at the moment. A question about 529 plans. How
Yeah.
are they? Who do they? How are they viewed, and which 529 plans are considered parent assets or not?
529 plan that you, the parent, have opened with the student as a beneficiary is an asset owned by the parent, and that's how you want it to work. Uh, there are there's one little nuance, especially for folks who may be earlier in the process, that's worth noting, which is if somebody other than the parent or the student has a 529 plan where that student is a beneficiary, it's indivisible to FAFSA. It doesn't exist or impact your student aid index. And so if you end up in a scenario where there's a uh, grandfather, grandmother, uncle, aunt, very generous friend who happens to have a 529 plan that where they've made your student the beneficiary, that would never get reported in any of this.
Somebody's asking about HSAs. Are they included anywhere?
Good question. I need to go back to the reference slide to make sure.
Yeah, I just did a quick check, and they are not, HSAs are not considered assets.
Thanks. Good question here from Emma on when you have, so some of you may have multiple 529 plans for multiple children. And when you're filling out FAFSA, you're filling it out for one child at a time. And you're not meant to include the aggregate value of 529 plans that are actually meant for another student as well when you're doing so. And so if there's myself and Debbie are, I'd say, two different beneficiaries of 529 plan, just make sure that when you're filling out the FAFSA, for me, you're only including the value of the 529 plan where I am the beneficiary there. So good question on RSUs that are not yet exercised. I have a few pointers on that and some more specific things that we've written down, just gotten checked by people that I'm happy to send you if you wanted to email me or somebody on my team. It does get a little bit more nuanced. If I'm not mistaken, we may have hit the major questions. And so this slide is a little bit of an eyesore. Uh, Forgive me for it, but it is my attempt to help you better understand what does your student aid index number actually mean in the context of how expensive school you may be attending. And so this is a simplified version of the world. That's just meant to kind of show you along this grid, what would your student aid index be if you were a family of four, where the parents are married and filing taxes jointly based on your income on the left-hand side and your assets across the top. And so this is an approximation. There's more nuance that would go into this based on the exact numbers that you would input into FAFSA. but it is generally pretty close to what would get spit out. And so, as an example, if you are in the, let's say, $250,000 of assets, and we'll just look at, for simplicity's sake, $200,000 of income, you're roughly in the middle of this, you're at a $53,000 student aid index. That is very high. Now, it's high from the perspective of the aid that the financial aid office is able to provide you. Now, the way to read what is interesting here is, again, the formula for whether the school is able to do anything for you is making sure that they start with that cost of going to school, so that cost of attendance number, and they subtract your student aid index number. And if there's a gap between those two, that's what the school defines as your financial need. In about 5 minutes, I'll get into some more nuances around that. But if your student aid index is higher than your cost of attendance, there's nothing the school could possibly really do for you on from a needs basis. There's a little bit of nuance to that, but generally speaking, it's highly unlikely. And so what you see in yellow is really just meant to communicate, for example, if your cost of attendance for the school you're going to is $40,000, then some combination of income and assets in the yellow bucket might get you some version of financial aid from the school on a needs basis. The green area is to say, all right, what if you're attending one of the more expensive programs that has a cost of attendance of $90,000? Well, then you still might be eligible for some forms of aid that a school could provide up to the green buckets. But if your SAI falls into the red bucket towards the bottom, it's just fundamentally unlikely that a school is going to be able to offer you much, if anything, in the way of aid. And then the examples I'll go through in 2 minutes. The federal aid is only one portion of aid that could be available to you as a family. There is also sometimes institutional aid, some money that the school has at its disposal that it might be able to allocate towards you. The conclusions I'm drawing here are really just meant from the perspective of the federal aid. And so some schools might have different rules where, based on their different cutoffs, you may be eligible for some type of money that they can provide you. But the last kind of real takeaway here is to say income is a really big driver. Your eligibility for different forms of federal aid because of the way that SAI gets calculated. And so if you end up in a scenario where your income is in the 300 or 250 to really 350 plus range, regardless of how much assets you have, it starts to become highly unlikely that your student aid index number would approach something that would allow the school to allocate federal forms of aid other than loans to you. And yes, I had one question here. The parent income used as an example here is AGI from the tax form for parents who are married filing jointly. And really, this is a rough approximation. I wouldn't use this chart as this is what your SAI will be, but it will be relatively close to this. The exact assumptions that you end up putting in will shift this a little bit to the left or right. All right, one slide on how to potentially minimize your student aid index. I'll start off with saying that there's not a lot of things that you can actually do to change a student aid index. And although there may be people who will try to sell you something claiming that they can help you understand what you can change in your asset allocation to achieve this, what I'm showing you on this slide is really the core of what you can do to impact your SAI. The first is asset purchase timing. And so one of the weird quirks about how the FAFSA form works and how SAI gets calculated is that you're reporting assets, you're answering the questions about assets in the FAFSA form, based on the value as of the day that you submit the form. Uh, a lot of types of assets are not meant to be reported on FAFSA. And so things like your car or let's say the roof repair you just did or the HVAC system you just installed, those are not assets in the eyes of the FAFSA form. And so if you are in a position where you know that you have to make a large one-time purchase for something that you need anyway, that you're going to do over the next few weeks or months, then an interesting quirk of FAFSA is that if you wait until you actually take what would have been cash and turn it into a car or into a roof or an HVAC system, then your student aid index would go down because you're no longer reporting the value of cash that was in your account. It is now turned into an asset that doesn't get reported. Uh, the second, and the common mistake that I see people make is there are questions in the asset portion of FAFSA that some people mistakenly forget to think of as a net value. And by that, what I mean is, let's say, for example, you have an investment property that's worth $500,000 and you have a mortgage of $300,000 on that property. Sometimes you want to make sure that you're reporting the net value of that asset when you're reporting the value of real estate. And so instead of reporting 500,000, you would report 200,000. You got to subtract out the mortgage. The same is true when you're reporting the value of business assets. Same will be true if you're reporting the value of, let's say, like a levered equity portfolio. And so just be really careful when you're reporting the value of assets that if this is relevant, you're not that you're subtracting out the amount of debt that exists against those assets. It can make a very big difference to your student aid index. The third that we did touch on briefly was 529 plans that are owned by somebody other than the parent or the student. And so just to double down on this, if grandma or grandpa or somebody else have made your child a beneficiary on a 529 plan, please don't include the value of that 529 plan in any portion of your FAFSA form. It is purposefully not meant to be included. And then the last two things to touch on here. One, we, at the beginning of this presentation, we're looking at how a parent's income gets translated into SAI. And one of the key things there was that based on the size of your family, the formula says you have a certain amount of money that needs to be used for basic living expenses. And one of the things that impacts that is really just the number of people in the household. And so when you are filling out FAFSA form, you'll be asked to confirm the number of people in your household. And it sometimes may seem trivial. You want to make sure that that's accurate. So if your household size is 5 instead of 4, please make sure to update it to 5 because it will protect more of your income from counting towards the student aid index calculation. And then finally, this will be a segue to a future webinar that we do. The FAFSA form is, again, based off of your income from 2 years ago. And for a lot of people, what they earned 2 years ago is simply not the same as what they're earning today. And if that is the case for you, there is an appeal process that we'll go through that can help you communicate to the financial aid office what your new income is, or if you, let's say, have not been able to earn income this year, and they'll be able to use that to potentially recalculate your student aid index using a more updated number. I'll pause there before we go into how this actually impacts your financial aid package.
So Chris, there's a question, I think it came up twice, about if you have 2 students in college at the same time, any way to handle that?
For the purpose of student aid index, that you just want to make sure that you're only including the 529 plans that are relevant for the student whose form you're filling out that day. Uh, but there is another thing that we'll touch on in the appeals webinar, which is there's actually a question in FAFSA that asks you how many people in your household are going to be in college at the same time this year. If you have two students in college, you're going to probably answer two. And unfortunately, the form doesn't do anything with that. You have to actually appeal to each school, like one appeal for each student to say, hey, my SAI is not reflective of how much of my assets and income are actually available to pay for school because I have two children who are in school at this time. And the formula for student aid index does not take that into account. Uh, it's a bit of a quirk because under the old version of this form, if you put that you had two children that were in college at the same time, the math would change and it would become a little bit more favorable to you. When they changed it, the form a few years ago, that no longer became the case automatically. And you actually have to, unfortunately, submit an appeal for the school to have a chance to reconsider how they calculate the amount of aid available to you. Uh, I'm going to try to go through this just a little bit more quickly so that we save more time for, I'd say, more questions at the end potentially. But I want you to pretend for the next couple of slides that I'm a financial aid officer who is doing my best to
Asking for
allocate
having a concussion,
aid to you.
and we really don't feel like
Oops,
we've
sorry,
got
sorry,
somewhere to
Chris.
go right to
No
Pawnee,
worries.
Let
North
me
Carolina.
go ahead. Sorry about that.
No problem. So again, the example that we've been using was for this family of four married filing jointly. And for the student, we got to a student aid index of 5,276. And what I'm going to try to do is walk you through an example aid package that you might receive in March or April. Uh, so this is a new slide. I'm going to basically walk you through the super high level, and then I'm going to go through all of this on a very detailed level of how these numbers get calculated. And I'll try to do this relatively quickly since we're coming up on time, but bear with me for a moment. So what we're going to end up walking through is really how do you get from the cost of attendance, so the sticker price of going to school, to the level of financial need that the school thinks you have as a family, and then the different buckets of money that they can provide to you that can chip away at that financial need. And for the example that we did just go through, we're going to pretend that the student is attending a school that has a $20,000 cost of attendance. And once you filled out FAFSA, you got to that roughly $5,300 student aid index. And so from my perspective now, as the person who has to put together your package, what the math tells me is, in simplistic terms, that you have about $5,300 that's available to help pay for school, and that your gap is going to be $14,700. And based on a certain set of rules, I'm now supposed to say, can I offer you a few forms of federal aid that are grants that don't have to be paid back? If you still have financial need after I give those to you, can I offer you an on-campus job called federal work study? And if you still have need after that, can I allocate to the student some either one or two types of federal student loans that only the student can use? And in many cases, if not most cases, what I can actually do for you just from my federal bucket of money is not going to cover all of your financial need. And even in this example that we're going through, this family is still going to have a little bit over $5,000 of financial need left. And in order to actually meet that remaining financial need, then I'm going to have to tell you, look, you have two options now. Uh, if you don't have, let's say, savings that you can contribute towards school, then either you could use a Parent Plus loan available from the federal government, or you could find a private loan to help fill that remaining gap. So what I'll just try to do right now is just tell you a little bit more of how the numbers of what I'm able to give to you are calculated. I'll do a quicker version of this so that we have more time for questions, but you'll also get a copy of these slides. And I tried to put as much detail on them as I could so that this would be somewhat self-explanatory. So really, again, that first thing that I was just walking through in the last slide is meant to say, what is the level of financial need that I've calculated that this family has? All right, they had a $5,276 student aid index based on what we have to charge for a school this year. You have $14,700 of need that is left. The first thing I can do is potentially award you something called a Pell Grant, which is money that doesn't have to be paid back. You may have heard about Pell Grants. There's two different ways that you can qualify for them. I'm not going to go through those in a lot of detail, but the general thing to understand here is that you have to have a student aid index on the lower end to be able to qualify for a Pell Grant in most cases. There are some rarer exceptions, but if your student aid index is on the higher side, you're just not going to be eligible based on the math to qualify for this first bucket of money that doesn't have to be paid back. So either you have a low AGI, which is going to be defined as a percentage of the poverty line, or you're going to go through this really simple formula, which says, look, I'm able to offer you some amount potentially of money here, but the maximum I can give you is $7,395. And I can only offer you whatever is that maximum amount minus the student aid index for you. And so in your case, your student aid index was roughly 5,300. So I take the max Pell Grant, I subtract the SAI, and I'm able to give you $2,119 for this year. This is not an amount for all 4 years of school, it's just an amount for this year. And so that's the first step and how I would actually calculate the Pell Grant that's available to you. Clearly, you still have financial need after I've given you this $2,000. There's a second bucket of money that I might be able to allocate to you, not for certain, but that I might be able to. And I can offer you up to $4,000 through this second grant that is available to me from the federal government. I can't tell you exactly how much I'm going to be able to give to you. Each school has a slightly different way that they'll allocate how much of this funding that they'll give to people. But generally speaking, again, this is going to go to people who have a lower SAI. And so if your student aid index is below zero, you're a lot more likely to get this bucket of money than if it is in positive territory. So not all that many people will get this, but it is available to me if you have a low SAI. That's all the free money that is available to me as a school to give away to you. Now I can give you potentially an on-campus job that is in part subsidized by the federal government under a program called Federal Work Study. There's not an exact formula that I can tell you right now for how much I can give you, but you can think of in many examples that we've seen somewhere between $1,000 and $5,000 per year of federal work study that I've seen commonly allocated towards students. But this is a job. It'll typically be an on-campus job. And it's just meant to be a way that you can earn money to help pay towards your remaining level of financial need. So let's just assume for this case that I was able to give you $1,000 of federal work study. You still have some financial need left. And so all I can offer you at this point is one of or two loan programs from the federal government. We have an hour plus long presentation that we typically do in May, June, July, and August that goes through how the federal loan programs work in a lot of detail. So forgive me for going through this as quickly as I am, but in the example that we're using here, for this family, I would probably be able to give this family $3,500 of loans that the student can take out under something called a subsidized direct loan. And I'd be able to give them another $2,000 of loans under something called an unsubsidized direct loan. And all that really means is that for the first 3,500 I'm able to give you, there's not going to, interest won't start accruing until after you graduate. And that's the most money that I can give you that doesn't charge interest until after you graduate for that year. After that amount, I can give you another $2,000. Unfortunately, interest will start accruing on that once the money is received by the school from the government on your behalf. But that is really all I can make available to you. And so after all of those things, you're still going to have some level of financial need that I've not been able to meet as a result of the federal buckets of money that are available to me. In this example, that's going to be a little bit over $5,000. You still need to find some way to pay to the school to meet your full tuition bill for the year. I hope that's been helpful, just rundown of the order of buckets of money that are available to a financial aid office to give to you from at least the federal perspective. What I'll just add to this is that there are other buckets of money that a school can have. There are, in many cases, forms of state-based aid. There are institutional buckets of money that some, but not all schools have. And so there are some schools that are able to be very generous and to help you meet a lot of your remaining financial need without having to take on loans. But for many programs, unfortunately, their financial situation is not like that. And they'll tell you that once you reach this point of remaining need, you're really going to have two options. And that's either going to be, assuming that you're not able to get more scholarships or something, that you can use another loan from the government that only the parent can take out, or you can go find a loan from somewhere else to try to pay for school. And so the last 2 minutes that I'll just give you here is really just how Juno fits into this process. I started Juno with one of my classmates 7 years ago because I needed student loans to pay for my MBA program. We tried an experiment where we said, let's bundle together 500 of our classmates who all need student loans for the same fall semester. And let's ask a bunch of different banks and credit unions if they're willing to give better rates and terms to our group than we could get on our own. A few of them said yes. We got them to compete with each other. We selected a lender who offered much lower rates to our group, and Juno was born. And for the last 7 years, we've expanded a very similar concept to now over 200,000 people. Juno is not a lender. We're completely free to parents and to students. We don't do a hard check on your credit. You can think of us more simply as a wait list. And between now and really the beginning of May, anybody who may have a student who is going to college next fall or beyond, we would just ask you to potentially just sign up for the wait list. We're not selling you anything. We're not going to ask you for money. We're going to keep you updated on really what we're able to find in the market that could be a good solution for people who may need money when it comes to next summer. We've done this for 7 years in a row. In general, the larger we're able to grow a group of people who join this wait list, the more negotiating leverage we have over the entire market to try to convince people to provide better rates and terms to our group than people can get on their own. And so really, that's our reason to exist. Can we help you find something better through Juno that you can get on your own? And on June 1st, typically, we'll just send you something that says, here's the best we've been able to find. Here is the 2-minute process where you can check your rates. And if you find a better rate somewhere else, we're typically able to match that lower rate anyway. So this is my last slide, and we'll turn it back over to Q&A after this. I can promise you, we've now done this for 7 years. There is no cost to sign up to Juno. There never has been, and there never will be. There's no credit check required when you sign up, or even there's also no hard credit check just to check your rates through Juno. And you're not obligated to do anything when you join our waitlist. You can just think of it as one additional free option that can help you learn more about different ways that you could pay for the upcoming year. And most people, I'd say, I would hope that once over the next few months, you learn more about appealing your financial aid awards and different ways so that you can increase the amount of money that is available to you that doesn't have to be paid back, that you don't actually need anything through Juno. But in case you do, joining the waitlist will just get you access to whatever the best thing is that we've been able to offer. And whether you end up using Juno or not, our team is set up to provide free one-on-one support to you for really any topic related to student financial aid, now or during the summer. So you can always feel free to reach out to us, and we're more than happy to chat over any medium that you like. Thank you very much for bearing with me through that. And let's switch back to questions.
So here's a question. Somebody is asking about the CSS profile, which we really didn't go over tonight at all.
Yeah.
But just wondering if they said, if I'm only filling out the CSS profile, how do I know what my SAI is?
You'll be submitting your FAFSA form, and you'll still get your SAI number at the slide that I showed you quite a bit earlier in the presentation.
So my comment would be also that if you're filling out the CSS profile, you should also be filling out FAFSA. It's very unlikely that somebody only fills out the CSS profile and doesn't fill out FAFSA.
Yeah, it's more often, if not almost always, required.
Right.
That's a good question. Yeah.
So they're asking Chris, like, because we have parents here with younger students, if their student isn't going to college, if their student is like a junior in high school now or a sophomore, can and should they still be signing up for Juno now? Will they be part of the right group when their student does need to go to college?
Yes, so you absolutely can, and you can select a future intended graduation year from the list. So we'll basically just have a head start on including you for a future batch of people that we're trying to help, but there's no requirement. Yeah, we won't be sending you the same messages that we'll send to people who need money for this year, but it will be easy for you to, if you are curious, book time with anybody on our team to get help with any question that you might have. And if I didn't mention, it really is free one-on-one support for as long as you need it.
So somebody is asking to, maybe this is just to understand what to report from an investment account. They're saying, how do I report a stockbroker account as an asset? Do I report the whole value or just the unrealized gains?
You report the whole market value for, yes. Because the way to think about it would be the unrealized gain still has a base, and that base, if it were, let's say, sitting in a different account, would still be reported as an asset on FAFSA. So you are reporting the whole market value.
Can a HELOC that's on an investment property, and that so an investment property has to be reported, can the HELOC be deducted from the asset value?
It should be able to. And this is a really good question. I strongly believe that the answer is yes. I just want to get a backup source that I could potentially send you as an answer that you may be able to rely on. I wouldn't want you to rely on that comment without me being able to send you an actual source. So if you did want to reach out to me at chris@joinjuno.com, just CHRIS at joinjuno.com. I have the backup documentation somewhere for that exact scenario that I can pull up and send to you.
So this question actually was asked earlier as well about how quickly does somebody need to fill out FAFSA? Do they need to fill it out right away when it's open, or is it fine to fill it out as long as they get it done before the college deadline?
So this is a really good question, and I want to answer it in two ways. One is uh, what buckets of funding can run out if you wait to fill out FAFSA until later. And so let's maybe just start off with FAFSA opened a little over a month ago, but you can fill it out for a long time to come. You can absolutely fill it out a month before school starts. You can even fill it out all the way through June 30th of the following year. To put it more simply, this form is meant in any given academic year to help families who have any amount of financial need potentially throughout that academic year. And so you could get to, let's say, the beginning of the spring semester. Maybe you hadn't filled it out yet. Well, it's not too late to fill it out. You could still fill out that form in your spring semester and at least get access to the federal student loans that would be available to you. It is generally helpful to fill it out on the earlier side for two specific reasons. One is if you're attending an in-state school, there is some likelihood that there are state-based aid programs that may be available to you, but that have earlier deadlines. And so if you maybe actually go to Road to College's YouTube page, you can see on the most recent FAFSA tips and tricks webinar, a breakdown of some of that. And there's also, let's say in the presentation, a link to the deadline for filing FAFSA to be eligible for each state's version of financial aid programs. The second reason you might want to fill it out earlier is that two of the things that you see on this slide, they actually can run out. So the first is this pot of money called FSEOG. Each school gets a limited amount of money each year, and they do their best to allocate it based on the people who have asked for financial aid before the year starts. And so if you're submitting FAFSA too late, it's possible that you just may not be able to get this bucket of money. And the second is federal work study. In theory, it can run out because, again, each school gets a limited amount of it that it is allowed to allocate towards students. And if that runs out, you won't be able to get it. All of the other forms of federal aid that are available to you, those are available whether you fill out FAFSA today or you fill it out a few days before school starts. The last thing that maybe I should have touched on is the schools themselves may have deadlines for when they want you to fill out FAFSA by in order to allocate institutional aid. So just any need-based aid that they may be at liberty to provide you. And so you would really want to check in with any schools that you're applying to and make sure that you're submitting FAFSA before any date they're communicating to you that they need it filed by.
So, Chris, somebody is asking about a rental property, and they said, what about a rental property that we individually own? If we convert it to an LLC, could that count as a small business and not report as an asset?
And first, we'll just push back on the premise. It's a good, interesting question that I've heard a handful of times. Businesses still get reported as an asset. There's a bit more complicated formula as to how a business gets reported. I think it is here. I didn't go into this for the sake of the presentation because it gets a little bit too detailed, but you are supposed to also, there's a question in the FAFSA asset section that asks you about the value of businesses that the family owns. And there is a set of adjustments that happen to whatever value you put there. So it will still have an impact on your student aid index. There is a little bit of gray area in some cases about whether a property that sits under a certain ownership structure would count as a business or count as an investment property. I spent 2 weeks last year trying to get more clarity on whether there's certain rules around what you must do or must not do. Honestly, it fundamentally is a little bit of a gray area, and I couldn't get a straight answer. So I would just say this is not likely to be the type of optimization that would make a difference to your student aid index. And regardless of how you classify that property as a business or a property, it is still going to show up in the assets portion of your student aid index.
Let's see. Oh, here's a good question. What can be done if the SAI is double what it should be according to the income versus assets chart that you shared?
Let's go back to the chart. If that is the case, please reach out to me and I'll just help you understand step by step what's driving that. Because often enough, I've seen people potentially just look at that. There are different reasons why that can happen. And it's usually just about a mismatch of timing on the income someone is using in a calculator, or in some cases, they're looking at income on this chart that might be slightly different than the income that got included on the FAFSA form. When you fill out FAFSA, it's meant to, one of the changes that happened over the last 2 years was that it automatically pulls in your IRS filing. It doesn't do it for everybody, but it does it under most scenarios. And in some of the cases where it doesn't automatically pull it in, people manually enter parts of what they need to. There's a bunch of different reasons why this can happen. The last thing I'll just note on this chart is the example of the chart you see in front of you. It assumes that the student has no assets and no income. So that could also be something driving it.
The other thing that could be driving it is, I think that this error still happens if you've done a rollover of a retirement account. I think, I don't know if you know anything about this, Chris. I don't think that's ever really been fixed, and that might cause higher SAIs.
Yes, and I think that's maybe best answered as, if you think there's a a couple of different really good student aid index calculators that are out there. And I think the best one I've seen is at mefa.org, MEFA. If you use any of these calculators, just to get like the quick 5-minute read of what you think student aid index is, and it ends up being very different than what the FAFSA form itself actually spits out, then it is very likely the reason that Debbie just mentioned around rollovers. And if there's other differences between the number that you calculate and the number that the form calculates, there may be things you can do in the appeals process to just let the financial aid office know that maybe some of the assumptions that are being used behind the math may be slightly off or incorrect. Long-winded way of saying this is a starting point. Most people think that this is the end point, but
Right.
For those of you who are parents of high school seniors, you are listening months before, let's say, most people start paying attention to this stuff. For those of you who are parents and students who are younger, you are very far ahead of the game and really should be at least a little bit proud of that. I think when you get a lot of this information and you get fully prepared, you should think about it as having an objective. And your objective at this point of the year is to better understand how these numbers do get calculated and to be prepared for deciding, am I going to or am I not going to appeal the results of the financial aid letter when I finally do get that back? When we actually do the presentation early next year, there'll be situations where you will perhaps listen to it and watch it and decide there are reasons that I may be able to appeal my financial aid letter preemptively, things I can communicate to the financial aid office before they even calculate what is available to me. And if I can do those things, then maybe I can actually increase the amount of aid available to me by decreasing the student aid index number that the financial aid office is using.
So, Chris, what if we end on this question, which nobody really asked, but I think it's good to address. What can people really make big changes to what their SAI is? And what I mean by that, can they, move money around or change their financial situation that it's going to be worth it to make these changes to reduce their SAI? And the other reason I say this is because I see it myself. I see ads all the time about come to our webinar and we'll show you how you can reduce your your SAI or get more aid. And just kind of like wonder what you feel about if those actions are really worthwhile.
It's a great question, and short answer is there's a very limited number of things you can do, and you shouldn't have to pay to learn what those things are. We're going to cover some of the things that you would want to do to appeal your SAI based on roughly 12 reasons why you may be able to do so at the beginning of next year. But besides those things, which are meant to say, what is new information I can provide to the financial aid office that the FAFSA form doesn't already capture? The only other things you can really do to impact your SAI fall into these buckets. One, think about this slide, the asset purchase timing. If you're going to submit FAFSA tomorrow, you have cash sitting in an account and you know that you're going to have to install a new HVAC unit in a week, you can wait a week to submit FAFSA. Nothing is going to change, and your SAI is going to be lower because you're now reporting fewer assets. And the only other thing you can actually do that is proactive is if you just happen to be in a situation where your child, let's say the student, has some cash sitting in an account, you could theoretically have that transferred to an account owned by you. There may be tax implications depending on the amount, but shifting some assets that would be more heavily penalized if the student owns them than if the parent owns them is the other thing that you can potentially proactively do to impact your student aid index and get it lower. Most of the other things that you would consider doing, the system is kind of set up to not let those loopholes impact the amount of aid that would be available to you. It's just the truth at the end of the day. And if you think back to this chart just for a moment, the maybe last thing I'll leave you with is, in order to qualify for material amounts of aid from at least the federal side, you need to have a pretty low student aid index. If your student aid index is on the margins, and on the margins is typically below 10,000, then there may be things that you can do that can lower it enough to get you more free money and more types of aid that don't result in loans. And if your student aid index is generally above that, you can make a lot of different changes that are highly unlikely to make any impact on the amount of aid that the school is able to provide to you. And I don't say that to be negative in any way. I just say that to let you know that you don't need to go find a bunch of different ways to try to change this number, because in most cases, this number is not going to change by enough to actually impact the amount of aid that you'll receive. What you should focus on more is thinking through the different possibilities that you'd have to appeal your financial aid award letter, as well as opportunities to get more merit-based aid from the school, which means your student's been admitted to more than one place, can you use both of those offers of admission to potentially get one of those schools to offer a larger scholarship or discount in order for them to attend. You only have so much energy in this entire process. The actual savings are going to come from making sure you're more proactive in that appeals process than they are in shifting your SAI up or down by a smaller amount.
And the other thing I'll add is your energy is better spent in researching the colleges and deciding on what colleges your students should apply to. So college choice will have a tremendous impact on how much aid you might get, whether your student is going to receive merit scholarships, and what your net costs will be. So, think about that in terms of what colleges is your student really applying to? How much do you know about those colleges in terms of whether or not they offer need-based aid, merit scholarships? And then, that's going to make a bigger impact on what your total final cost is. And then in addition to appealing, those two actions will have more of an impact than trying to rearrange your finances, honestly, kind of too late in the process. Okay.
Very well said.
Thank you, Chris, as always. So informative.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Thank you, everybody, for sticking around the whole time, and look forward to seeing you at the next one, hopefully.
Yeah, yes, please, look in your emails. We have lots of different webinars of this type coming up, and they will all be worthwhile to attend. Okay, good night,
Have a great night,
everybody.
everybody.
Thanks, Chris.